All right, we should be good to go. My apologies again for the copious delays, but I'm glad to be here and to be doing this. So I'd like to open my talk by appreciating everyone that's decided to come here on this Friday evening, giving up your time to hear one interpretation of a path forward with AI ethics. So I know there's plenty of other things that you guys could have been doing with your time, so I appreciate you guys being here, so I'll do my best to make it worth your while. I'd also like to thank both MUPS and RAID for having this auspicious collaboration event, first of its kind, it seems. So I'm very glad to be here, and it's an honor to do this. I'm very hopeful that this talk will be valuable, or at least, at the very least, interesting enough to disagree with. I don't want to unnecessarily blather on, so I'll try to make this nice and short and sweet for all of you. Why have I decided that it might be a good idea to try and take the perspective of something like Japanese archery into the context of AI ethics? One reason is it seems to me that AI ethics is, maybe stereotypically something that is a little bit more traditionally dense or potentially dry. And so to be able to have, a little bit more of a sufficient interest into this area, trying to make an analogy across to something that might itself seem a little more interesting, might be able to ride on the coattails of it. But another reason is that if everything works out, then I'm hoping that I would be able to frame AI ethics as something that's more akin to a practice as compared to just a set of ideas. Now, to do this, I'll be going through three main sections of this talk. And through each of these three stages, there is three objectives that I'm hoping to accomplish through them. Now, in the beginning, with setting the stage, I want to introduce how Australia is currently approaching AI ethics, so essentially getting the context for where we're currently at in Australia. Even though there's many other countries' data that we could look at, I felt it was more relevant to talk about Australian and Australian AI ethics. Then the second part, which is the interesting one, which is the Japanese Kyudo, the Japanese archery aspect of things, how I apply that, how I think it might be useful to apply that to AI ethics. And then the last part, in one final issue, will be, in my mind, a consideration that isn't usually had, isn't something that we usually think about when we go about making these guidelines or these sets of principles to engage with AI ethics. So, to begin with, we have these very big, long documents that we have access to, and if you have the time and interest, then I encourage you to go and look at them yourselves. But in place of them, I've provided a few kind of summaries, I guess, of the most important points of the broader principles to save us a little bit of time. The main document that we'll see here is the Australian AI Ethics Principles, which is then built upon based on a few other documents. Now, the first place we can come to check to see what Australia is up to is this organization, the IAPP AI Governance Centre. It's not very clear, I'm sure, for you guys, considering the very small text, but one of the really cool aspects that we can see from here is Australia was actually one of the first countries in the world to enact a set of AI ethics principles, which is readily accessible, but it was built upon, based on two important documents, which themselves are a couple hundred pages each. And as we can see, does that show? Yeah. So as we can see here, UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of AI. But if we were to actually look on the page, we will see that the IEEE, if any of you are doing any electrical engineering or have any context in that way, would have heard of before. But these two main large groups of documents, keeping in mind this isn't just a single document, this is multiple documents with many, many people. So this is a very big reduction of what is much a larger consideration. But we can see that there's quite a few things that are being considered here. And I'm not wanting to spend too much time on this because it is just kind of presenting the case for it. Again, take your time, investigate these as much as you would like in your own time. But this just gives you an awareness of where things are kind of coming from, I guess. This then develops the Australian AI ethics principles. This is a part of a broader framework as well that Australia is enacting, but this is the principles that they have chosen to use. And as we see things like human, societal, environmental well-being, human-centered values, reliability, safety, transparency, accountability, all of these very important aspects. But one of the things that I think when I see something like this is unless we have a deep interest in this sort of thing, it might seem like it's a little bit too dense, or there might be a little bit too much to remember or consider. So then how does Kyudo, which translates to the way of the bow, Japanese archery in its essence, it's this perspective that prioritizes a kind of humility and focus and a pursuit of truth that makes a metaphorically rich ground for discussing these topics, especially in ethics, especially in the context of rapidly evolving technology such as AI. And as I kind of alluded to, due to the complexity of these broader guidelines and these broader systems that these larger governmental bodies have presented, they can sometimes get a little bit complex and kind of hard to manage. So the idea here is that using Kyudo as an analogy for AI ethics simplifies things just a little bit and makes things a little bit more accessible, because we only need to remember 3 main things. Now, these are the 3 fundamental ethics of Kyudo. Now, for those of you who can speak or read Japanese, this would maybe immediately make sense, but these 3 aspects are Shin, Zen, and Bi, which broadly to English translate to truth, goodness, and beauty. Now let's go through each of these one by one. Again, not looking to spend too much time on this, just to provide a kind of simplified version of what I'm presenting here. Now Shin, truth. How could this potentially be applied to AI ethics? We can see that the importance of things like transparency and honesty in AI operations and algorithms is obviously very important. Having these systems be designed and deployed in a way that is understandable and accountable to users and stakeholders is going to be fundamental to making sure that these things are engaging in a way that is useful and helpful for humans and society more broadly. Secondly, goodness or Zen. How might this be incorporated? We can see this in ways of fairness and reliability, ethical AI use and well-being. And remembering that AI should be developed and used ethically within, the context of the society and the individuals that are utilizing it in a way that kind of promotes its well-being. And obviously ensuring that these AI systems don't perpetuate any particular kinds of biases or inequalities that is going to be very important for maintaining its fairness and justice, I suppose. Now the third part, beauty. This one is a little bit more, you could say, intangible to a certain extent when it comes to saying certain things like integration of AI or human-centered values. It's very important how we define each of these things. But to see how AI can be integrated in and enhance and not detract from the human experiencing, trying to foster a balance between this technological advancement and the preservation of human values is obviously quite important. But as we'll see here, using a framework such as this, such as the ethics that we find in something like Kyudo, again, the main motivating factor for presenting this kind of thing is to bring this and make it more applicable or more accessible to more people. Because remembering only a few things is obviously going to be a little bit more attractive than trying to remember, long lists of things and having to troll through these long kind of documents to find all these different things in their specifics. And all of those things are great. All of those longer documents, all of those very well worked hours making them is important and does have its place for those very specific people that are finding themselves in those roles and in those places where they are enacting these things. But when we're coming to a more casual or seemingly general audience, having something like this might be able to make things make a little bit more sense more quickly. And in this way, there's a few other things I think we can take from Kyudo outside of just these 3 fundamental ethics. And there's actually 4 of them, 4 small things that I think we can utilize as mindsets when approaching this kind of area. Firstly, as I'm sure a lot of you would have heard previously, the classic example of, the journey is better than the destination, that kind of thing, that kind of essence here being the process over the outcome. In Kyudo, something that's very important is when we are shooting, we are much more focused on our form. We are much more focused on how we are approaching the target as compared to whether we necessarily hit the target. And so this means that that form that we develop is much more important than whether we make an arbitrary hole in this paper target. This mirrors how we are wanting to kind of, present ourselves in ethical development and deployment of AI, whereby, the AI is developed and trained and implemented, including the different data sets that are used, the fairness of the algorithms, and the transparency throughout each of these processes are just as important as the effectiveness or the efficiency of the end product. Now, the second one is mindfulness and intention. Obviously, we all want to try to be as mindful and intentful as we can be, and taking a contrast with something like Kyudo and Kyudo practitioners, definitely endeavor to be as fully kind of present and mindful and aware of the actions that we are taking and the things that we might be doing. And so focusing deeply on these actions and these intentions is going to be important, especially in the area of AI development, to make sure that these conscious and deliberate considerations are kind of met with the appropriate ethical implications that they hold, including the potential consequences of their deployment in society throughout not only the developers and stakeholders, but the broader populace as well. So making sure that there's this ethical reflection and intentionality in their work is very important to make sure that we are getting the best kind of outcomes that we can hope for. The third one is a very big trope in Japan of master craftsmanship. And that extends itself to Kyudo being this path of endless practice and learning, emphasizing continuous improvement. I'm sure some of you would have heard of Kaizen before, trying to get 1% better each day. And taking this across into this AI ethics realm is endeavoring to have this, constant need for learning from mistakes and adapting to new challenges and improving these ethical standards and frameworks, and never really thinking that we've made it, right? Never thinking that we have gotten to a place where we don't need to learn, we don't need to develop, we don't need to grow in our understanding of these different things. Always being willing to learn and change as a beginner will be important to make sure that these systems are developed in a way that can change and adapt with society and with the needs that are present as different stages of development occur. And the last one here is in Kyudo, it teaches us this certain level of unity between the archer, the bow, and the arrow. And we are aiming for a certain kind of harmonious action that results in the arrow hitting the target as a byproduct of having this harmonious unity throughout our form, throughout the process that we are engaging with. And I guess we can see this as a kind of metaphor for the integration of AI systems within society, where technology, its users and its creators must work in harmony to ensure that the AI serves the common good, I suppose. And I feel like this reframing provides a more coherent narrative on the symbiotic relationship between creators, users, and technology in the context of AI ethics. But there is one final issue that I only came to think about after I'd essentially finished my preparations for this talk that I'd like to bring up and that I'd like to close things out here with. I feel like I've sped through things pretty quickly, and so we'll have even more time for a great Q&A. As I said, trying to make this as short and sweet as possible. This is probably also the most contentious part of this presentation because it does provide some perspectives that are very easily debatable. But of all the principles and guidelines that have been presented here, the philosophies and considerations we've made so far here, none of them have considered anything from the perspective of an AI at some point becoming its own individual, one deserving of right and respect for its own benefit, not ours. There are certainly better and worse ways to go about the development process, as I've already outlined in this talk. But it seems that practically all of the frameworks and discussion that's had in this area is primarily focusing on how we, humans, can extract as much value and benefit from it, the AI, without causing harm to other humans. And with the current state of things, these choices appear fine. But I would ask for how long? I know this is, again, a contentious point and is very easily debatable on its own, but I see it to be not only plausible, but in my view, I see it to be an inevitable reality that we will eventually have to face the reality of what we are creating here. Sentient AI will force us to reflect on not only what it means to be sentient, but also what it even means to be deserving of rights in the first place. This then obviously leads to further reflections about what claim we even have to the ownership of an artificial entity and so on. But that's enough to make up another talk entirely, so we won't touch on that here. But what I will end things here with, as we are at the end of this talk, again, I recognize that I might have sped through things a little bit quickly and there might be questions that you have, which I'm very keen to discuss in this Q&A, but I do hope that, if anything, that this talk has been able to plant maybe a seed or two of interest for you into the importance of this topic and the necessity of not only how we approach the development of these systems, but the ethical implications that their existence also imposes. I will finish with two quotes that I think are relevant here. If I can get, there we go. Canva is something else, I tell you. I tell you. All right, first quote is by Tristan Harris. I'm not sure how many of you recognize that name. If you would have heard of The Social Dilemma, he was one of the main directors on that. Does a lot of work in this kind of technology ethics space. But he says, with technology, you don't have to overwhelm people's strengths. You just have to overwhelm their weaknesses. This is overpowering human nature, and this is checkmate on humanity. My second quote actually comes from, I would hope most of you would know who this fellow is, Stephen Hawking. Success in creating effective AI could be the biggest event in the history of our civilization, or the worst. We just don't know. So we cannot know if we will be infinitely helped by AI, or ignored by it and sidelined, or conceivably destroyed by it. So that's my talk. Thanks for your time and attention. So, any points of interest, any questions, anything that you'd like to get off your chest, even a statement, if you might. I'm happy to go back through any of the slides as well. But yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off. Thank you for giving that talk. I thought it was very interesting. I think we just have like a fairly basic, like clarificatory question to start us off.
Sure.
So you kind of frame there's a kind of like section, or like within section 2, right? There's kind of like 2 different moments, right? And then there's the first one where you've got the kind of 3 different values of Kyudo, and then afterwards there's kind of like other sets of principles that can be applicable to AI ethics. My question is that you kind of frame those like 3 core concepts in Kyudo as a kind of heuristic for kind of non-professionals when dealing with various questions of AI ethics. And the question that kind of came to my mind is, that's awesome, that's great, but is there anything kind of like new and special that Kyudo is bringing to AI ethics, right? Like how is someone that's informed with the Kyudo worldview, if you can call it that, how would they approach AI ethics differently to someone that doesn't have that background, right? I was wondering if it was those principles that came afterwards, or if it was something else entirely.
Sure, very, very good question, very relevant question. I can only speak from my own perspective, right? Being someone who's in kind of a bit of both worlds, right? For me, the difference that I've found, at least from when I've gone on this journey of developing more in my kind of Kyudo practice, I guess, is I tend to think about ethics as holistically emanating from an individual, right? And so if we are able to improve or increase the quality and clarity that we have within our own lives, then that reflects within the work that we also do as well. And for me, the experience that I've had with Kyudo is the more that I've been able to learn as a result of that practice, the more that I've been then able to reflect on the importance of how I engage in these other seemingly disparate aspects of my life. So it might be difficult to come up with specific examples directly on the spot, but it's more so that's why I frame it as this perspective. So it's generally trying to take this as a way of thinking and porting that across into an area that might just focus on the specifics of how we are doing something in an AI context, like how we are creating a particular algorithm or this and that. But having something that's broader, that is more underlying each of these things, I feel like can act as a kind of safety net to a certain extent to make sure that is this aligned with our the deeper lessons that we have encountered through a practice like Kyudo, that then we see popping up in all of these other various aspects of our lives as well, and AI ethics being one of them. If that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
You said that it emanates from the individual, but that starting point from the individual. You know, some could say that that sort of is a bit sort of concerning because it's, you know, and Aristotelian might say different things because that sounds like a post-Hobbesian idea. You know, it's the individual that has to. I wondered, could you tell us more about emanating from the individual?
So you're speaking more broadly about the statement I made about feeling as though ethics is something that emanates from oneself. Sure. I mean, I feel like when it comes to the ethical actions we engage with, a lot of the time, what we can do is we can say, oh, well, there's this social standard, there is this thing that I want to, be aligned with, let's say, right? I feel like from my perspective, and unfortunately I'm not as well read as you might be, I'm not too sure about post-Hobbesian and this and that. I recognize the name, but I'm chronically underread, my apologies. From this undereducated perspective, I would say, sure, the terminology might be slightly different or might mean certain things in certain ways, but the way that I see it is that we can only focus and control on our actions coming from oneself. And when we try to create too many frames of reference outside of ourselves, outside of the responsibility, I suppose, we have to ourselves to be as well as we can be within the world, even pertaining to a particular kind of self-interest. That was actually the other idea I had for this talk, was this big discussion about self-interest and how almost everything comes from a place of self-interest. But that's obviously another talk in its own entirety. But yes, that's how I think about it. I think ethics is a function of that self-interest that is playing out in the outer space, let's say, if that makes sense, if that answers your question.
I could actually ask verbose. No, could I ask another question, please?
Sure, and then we'll go to Bo. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
One of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, whose idea is, you cannot step into the river once, and we are not. And he has this metaphor with bow. You're going backwards and also going forwards, and this tense friction. Could you elaborate more on this idea of friction?
Of friction?
Yeah.
Elaborate on the idea of friction.
Yeah, because also appears in your talk. So to be a bit more precise, the friction, you're also aiming forward and you're pulling backward.
I'm sure. I'll try to interpret your question as best as I can. In my practice of Kyudo, I see it as very meditative to a certain extent, but I see it as a great reflection of oneself through the process. And so when we are kind of raising the bow up and we're bringing it across and we're doing all of these motions, right? There's a certain tension that's necessary in that way, but we can't be too tense, right? Because once we get very tight and very stiff, then that's going to naturally affect how we go through this process, go through these motions. If one aspect is tensed early on, then that's going to affect it later on. That's going to affect another aspect later on, right? And so if we're talking about something like friction that you're talking about, I guess that some people have this battle between their rights and left hands. One's trying to push, one's trying to pull, and it's this conflict, right? But what we try, and obviously I'm still early in my journey, what we try to think about when we're going through this process is it's not that this hand is necessarily pushing so hard and this hand is pulling so much, but it's that they're kind of opening up, like we're opening up our shoulders and things are like a plain glass door, is it like those French doors that just kind of open together? It's like this, I don't know if you would call it synergy. I don't know whether you would call it a particular kind of cooperation, but I would say thinking about it too heavily in the context of friction or this fight, I think is likely the wrong way to kind of consider that dynamic in my perspective. Again, if that answered your question. Bo, what was your question?
Questions first.
No?
Would you be able to go back to the slide on beauty?
On which one? On duty?
On beauty.
On beauty, sure.
It's really interesting, right? Because obviously it's not something that we typically think of as being a sort of a component towards thinking about AI. And even in, and I guess the broad question would be, I want to hear a little bit more about this, as an approach to thinking about it, but perhaps as a prompt. It would be something like, when the first sort of big waves in the last year, 2 years or so of AI generated art, for example, came out, there was quite widespread sort of disdain at both an aesthetic and moral level at sort of these sort of things, right? So I guess from that sort of starting point, which is that already sort of something people think of AI, you don't usually think of AI as being beautiful, or yeah, I kind of want to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I guess to give a little bit of context as to why this is a value, or this is why this is an ethic within Kyudo, is a little bit of a historical account, right? So in ancient times, obviously Kyudo came about as a military kind of operation, right? As an effective strategy to be able to, engage with one's enemy. And there became a certain point where there was a shift from this military utility. And there are still some sects of Kyudo that value this more military utility, and they have very different values. But there was this distinct shift towards this prioritization of beauty, and it's especially seen in the bow itself. It's a very long, asymmetrical, almost 2.5 meter long bow, right? Not extraordinarily useful on a battlefield, right? But they decided to keep it this length because there was a particular, I'm not sure if you would name it just aesthetic prioritization or a particular kind of valuing of what that even means. That like deeper appreciation for maintaining something that, simply looks a little bit better, or maybe, has a better approach in a less than practical context. When I think about beauty in respect to AI ethics and how that can impact society, I see it as having either great potential for a very beautiful enrichment and nourishment that can provide to broader society, depending upon how it is developed and depending upon how it is implemented and deployed. And I can also see a very polar version that doesn't take that consideration into account whatsoever. And so the reason why these two main things, obviously they come from the Australian AI ethics principles. There's many different kind of ways that we can view these, but I did try to at least tie it back somewhat to this list of things that Australia has presented. I think it's one of those things. Beauty is obviously dependent upon how we define it as well. And it can change based upon, for example, one person being able to appreciate certain works of art or being less receptive to those things. And so I feel like when it comes to this aspect, sure, there might need to be a certain level of interpretability of what beauty even means when it comes to something like AI. But if we're to take a coding or programming example, there's definite priority based on the things that are simpler, that are likely more easy to engage with or to be able to integrate into our understanding. Right? I believe it's like the Occam's razor or something like that. It's like taking the simpler of two options is the preferred choice. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but in that kind of way, I do see, funnily enough, a great beauty in prioritizing beauty, because I think a lot of times it can get lost amidst all of this efficiency and effectiveness and performance metrics and capabilities, and it can sometimes get lost in the mix of all of that excitement and hype. And so even if it might be a little bit more of merely an aesthetic property or something that isn't necessarily the most output-focused utility, I do think there is still definitely value in that way of holding that as a value and keeping that in one's kind of mind. Because if we are to think about a company developing a particular AI, one that prioritizes a little bit of beauty and one that doesn't prioritize really any beauty at all, I would imagine that the end result of those two companies' products would differ significantly. I notice two interesting examples, one being Pi AI. I'm not sure if any of you would have heard of that. Kind of prioritizes this, emotional intelligence as insofar as it's possible. I would say that prioritization has a certain beauty to it because it's trying to have this deeper interaction with humans as compared to just highest performance and highest utility across the broadest range of things. And I'd say like little examples like this, in my mind, reflect that kind of deeper prioritization of something more than just performance or efficiency. I'm sure I went over things a few times, but I'm not sure if that answered your question. Anyone else? Anything else? Any statements? Any comments? Not even a question. Any thoughts? I can go back to any slide if you'd like, but I'll just leave it there.
I think talking about beauty kind of really distinguishes the practice of Kyudo from just like traditional ethics. It is like a unique element, I think, that to consider when thinking about ethics. Like you're not really going to find that explicitly in the list of ethics. So I think that's novel and nice to think about creating things because we think they're just cool or they're nice. Like not because we're not continually prioritizing utility. Yeah, it's a nice thing to consider.
Do you think we can over-prioritize utility?
I think so. I don't know what.
What does anyone else think? Do you think we can over-prioritize utility?
Yeah.
Or performance or metrics?
Yes, often prioritization, but I can sometimes lose the beauty and what's that they're creating.
For sure. I think at the end of the day, it helps us to remember why we're creating something as well. Like most, and again, this may be a very foolish thing to say, but I feel like most of the things that we do in some way is a bet towards some kind of connection with another person or group or community. And so if we get bogged down in just maximize capabilities, maximize this, maximize that, and we forget about the implications of what these capabilities might entail or where we might get certain training data from or this is or that, I wouldn't say that's very beautiful, right? And so that's one man's perspective, but I do think having this perspective can provide something novel to this discussion of AI ethics that even though, sure, if I was able to give, an hour-long talk, I might be able to dig into things a little bit more, but the main intention of this was just to give, an introduction to this potential set of perspectives that doesn't seem to have been engaged with or compared to before. Seems like you've written down a few things. Anything of note?
I think supply follows demand. Whatever society is going to demand is what AI is going to supply. And so the question is there's so much AI can do, and how do you control AI without controlling the entire culture?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I feel like answering that is going to be very important. I like to refer back to the military context of beauty, right? What sense would it make to prioritize this big unwieldy thing when there was already available these shorter bows that were much more useful and more kind of had more utility in that kind of space. But I feel like we're going to be asking different questions as society and culture kind of progresses and develops, insofar that there may be certain aspects of culture that come from our interactions with AI that hadn't existed previously. And that's going to be its own area of inquiry and inquest, I guess. So it's always going to be hard on the outset to try to answer these bigger questions. But that's why I'm thinking if we can do our best to frame this as a kind of practice that we need to, be mindful of and intentional and be able to be responsible and accountable and own in our interactions with it, then I think we're more likely to have a better outcome than a worse outcome, if that makes sense. Any final questions? Any little bottoms of the barrel? Oh, is that a question? I saw that mouth open.
I came upon this distinction once between morality and ethics. They say morality is commandments, right? they prescribe you should do this right, and ethics has more to do with character development. And in relation to this distinction, can you tell us more about? Yeah.
In regards to the distinction between morality
and ethics.
So you're saying morality being this kind of prescription,
yeah,
you should do this,
yeah,
and ethics being this more so, like this process of developing one's character. Yeah, I guess the only thing that I'd say on that is that in my mind, I can only, as I briefly touched on before, I can only ever command myself to do something, right? And I don't necessarily see the pursuits of people saying, you should, you have to, like, you need to be doing this. Whenever I'm having conversations with people where we might be on seemingly opposite sides of the ethical spectrum in a particular conversation, is generally what I try to do is all I'm looking for is consistency, right? All I'm looking for is whether or not there is a particular inconsistency in one aspect of an argument that they may be presenting, and then all I say is, hey, that seems like an inconsistency, maybe it's something to think about. So when it comes to this like prescription or prescribing of things, generally I don't find myself falling down that. Obviously when you're excited about something and it's this big cause, you're very much wanting to get your point across and to change things for the better, and that's great and that's fine, and I respect that. I think on a personal level, as long as each of us is endeavoring our best to be as honest and as sincere as we can be in our pursuit of truth, which is a fundamental pursuit in Kyudo as well. It's finding, a better or a deeper relationship with oneself through this process of understanding oneself through this practice. I think that's all we can really hope to do, just to be as honest and sincere in that process as we can be. And if we come up with some opposition, we have some kind of confrontation, let's say, argumentatively with an individual, all we can hope to be is open to that discussion and to potentially being wrong. And that, again, kind of links back into these ideas of not thinking we've ever made it, not thinking that we've ever kind of risen to this place of, godhood or kingdom, that we don't have the requirement of reflecting on why we formed our kind of opinions and our beliefs and this isn't that. Because once that happens, then things usually turn to shit, in my opinion. So always being open, always kind of, to make another martial arts reference, always being a white belt, even if you have a black belt on, being willing to learn something from anyone. If we can engage in that way, then, whether people want to choose to prescribe things or not, on an individual basis, I think individuals obviously are the atoms of society, and so if there's enough atoms that bounce around in a particular way, that's going to change the material of society, right? And so I generally like to converse about these things from a bottom-up approach, mostly. So, I hope that answered your question. Well, if that's all the questions, then I appreciate everyone for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions, and I appreciate the Q&A. So maybe we'll go to the pub or something.